welcome to this special episode of The Buck Stops Here from New York as we're tracking the return of Prime Minister Modi to the United States of America. Tonight in India, morning in New York, we're broadcasting from one of the trendiest restaurants in New York, Rohini Day's Vermilion, a rare restaurant which brings together, fuses Indian and Latin cuisine. Tonight on the program from the Vermilion, the two big stories we're looking at. Does Narendra Modi mean business as American CEOs flag their concerns about what's stopping them from making in India? That will be our big focus. But before that, of course, the big story today is that high-profile G4 summit that the Prime Minister is going to host, bringing together Germany, Japan and Brazil to push for a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. We'll be looking at India's big power push at the United Nations in this special broadcast from the Vermilion in the heart of New York. All right, so on a sunny New York morning, time now for a heated debate on the Buck Stops Here. Perhaps the most anticipated summit of this entire trip that the Prime Minister is making to the United States of America is going to be what's called the G4 summit. Prime Minister Modi on Saturday morning will be hosting three powerhouse leaders. We will see Germany, Brazil, Japan and India coming together at an India-chaired summit to push for United Nations reforms and to push for each other's bids for a permanent position at the United Nations Security Council. Is this permanent position battle a permanent struggle, or have we seen a tectonic shift? And are the Americans, for all the hype around the Indo-US relationship, being less than enthusiastic? That's going to be our big debate, our first lead debate on the Buck Stops Here from New York today. Let me introduce our guest. Joining me is Ambassador Hardball, one of our senior-most diplomats. He is the Vice President with the International Peace Institute, also been the permanent representative of India at the UN. Also joining me is Dhruv Shankar. He's with the German Marshall Fund with a special focus on Asia. Raj Goyal, former state representative from Kansas, is with us. From DC today, we're joined by Teresita Schaffer, somebody who has followed India for many, many decades. And also joining me from Delhi is senior diplomat Ambassador K.C. Singh. I'll start with you, Ambassador Hardball. In many ways, to me, this is even more significant, this summit, than the bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama. It's a power push, it's a statement of strength, it's usually a summit that's represented by foreign ministers. It's the first time in 10 years you're actually seeing the leaders of these countries, presidents and prime ministers, coming together. What's the messaging here?
You know, this G4 summit has the potential of being what you describe it or what you anticipate it could be. But you know, let's not prejudge the outcome.
Yeah.
The leaders have to meet on the 26th morning and they have to take a decision on whether the G4 wishes to once again put its bid forward, and if they do, whether they are willing to float a resolution, either a framework resolution or a country-specific resolution. I think what has happened in the last few days, particularly on 14th September, when the General Assembly adopted a text
for negotiations,
on text-based negotiations, and the text which is on the table, these are game changers. But the leaders have to take courage and they have to work the power of possibilities. And if they do that, yes, this could be this could overshadow anything else that the Prime Minister is going to be involved in.
So you would say as of now, what we know about his trip is the single most significant meeting on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly.
No, it's not my. It's not for me to do that kind of characterize it. Single. That you have the liberty of doing that. I choose my words more carefully. I would say that yes, it has the potential of being something very significant, because India, and I have some knowledge of that, having served here as permanent representative, India has more than the 128 countries' support which is required for a permanent seat. And I think the G4, which at some points of time has looked like a G3 or a G2, is now beginning to look more cohesive. And what happened on the floor of the General Assembly in a live webcast debate clearly shows that those countries, one country in particular, which pulled out all the stops, used inducements, threats, to stop that from happening.
China?
Well, you can.
Why are we being coy? I mean,
no, I'm not being coy. Yes,
it's
it's very well known that China has been opposed to Security Council reform for whatever reason. That may not be India specific. It may have something to do with another member of the G4. But I'm saying yes, this could have the potential. But you know, I am as I'm growing older, a little bit of cynicism gets the better of me. We have had these moments in the past, and we have not utilized those opportunities. Let me say about my tribe, the bureaucracy, and the political class in India, to which I am, I have a nodding acquaintance with the political class. Let me say they are extremely averse to risk, and unless they shed that risk aversion, nothing is going to happen. And I'm hoping that the four leaders, particularly Prime Ministers of Japan and India in particular, I know the Germans and the Brazilians also have their heart in it. I hope they take courage and they work the possibilities which are open to them.
Now, Dhruv, there is a sense that, you know, despite all the hype about Indo-US equations, the Americans have actually been less than enthusiastic. They have, in fact, bordered on indifference. When the United Nations 70 years commemoration happened in San Francisco, the Americans didn't even show up. So, are we going to see something that goes beyond the lip service of countries that back India's bid for a permanent seat?
We may or may not. I mean, it's up for the American government to decide. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of cynicism on the part of the US about UN reform generally. I mean, I think you alluded to that. I mean, even when President Obama came to India and his first time and he spoke, the wording of his statement was actually quite interesting. He said, "I look forward to a day when India can be a permanent representative, member of the UN Security Council." He didn't actually say that he would do anything to advance that objective. But I mean, that being said, I mean, I think there isn't really. I mean, of the United States objections, India is actually not a country that the United States has a strong objection to. I think some of it is the process of UN Security Council reform. Some of it is some of the makeup of and the constitution of a future UN Security Council. Some of the other members, I think there are more doubts about. But I don't see a strong. I don't see the United States as playing a very antagonistic role in this.
Do you agree, Ambassador? You said some things make you cynical, and I'm trying.
Well,
I'm going to try and get the perspective from Washington as well in a moment. But what do you think?
I would. I mean, as someone who's had the privilege of dealing with the United States for many years, I would encourage them to explicitly state their support for India in the documentation of this process. We've heard statements from President Obama. We've had other American, important people in the State Department articulate their support for India. But I did not see any evidence of that support being forthcoming in favor of India during the 5 years that I was permanent representative. And I also want to go a step further. I think in some respects the American position, along with the position of some other permanent members, was extremely unhelpful. Now,
so
is that going to change?
The Americans were not just indifferent, they were unhelpful.
They were unhelpful. I mean, I say that without any hesitation whatsoever.
I'm going to get Teresita on that in a moment. Raj, as a former state representative, what do you say?
Well, I think I may beg to differ a little bit in the sense that these things take time, as we know. And so the fact that the President of the United States obviously has a personal relationship with the Prime Minister, enjoys India, he has gone on the record. I was talking to my father last week, who was 81 years old, who was a combat veteran of the 65 war. The notion of India as a permanent member on the Security Council was not only laughable, it would have been unthinkable. So, as the ambassador knows, these things do take time. I think you're seeing.
But is it still unthinkable in real terms? I think I would interrupt you there and say unthinkable not at the level of conceptualization, but in translating that idea into reality.
This is absolutely a realistic.
If you float a resolution and the Americans have to take the floor with the entire proceedings cast all over the world, they're going to find it very difficult not to be supporting the world's largest functioning democracy.
So you're saying live stream this summit?
No, I'm saying all you need to do is somebody should float a resolution on saying whether there should in principle be an expansion of the Security Council, and then you will see the same replay. You see, it's possible to say one thing and do quite another in closed rooms, behind the scenes. Put pressure on the President of the General Assembly, the chair of the IGN. You had a new chair of the IGN and a new PGA, saw the difference. We've been struggling for it with years, but somebody has to decide that the time for this idea has come. Reform. If you can't do it on the 70th anniversary of the United
When will you
Nations,
do it?
you probably have to wait another 100 years.
I want to go to Teresita Shaffer.
But, you know, I mean,
do you agree the Americans have not just been indifferent, they've been unhelpful?
I don't know enough about the process. I've not been involved in it directly,
Yeah.
so I would defer to the ambassador on that. But one of the things, I mean, you do see that's been a big change in the last few months and years is not just the United States, but the number of other countries that have now come out in support of India's bid and larger UN reform. So I think you do see a window opening in some sense. But a number of the other countries in New York, the delegations seem to have expressed a lot of support for UN reform in general and India's position on the
But
UN
I guess what I'm asking is the shift in rhetoric or is the shift in substance? Ambassador Shaffer, let me bring you in. Ambassador Hardeep Puri making the point that the Americans were indifferent and positively unhelpful. And now you're seeing this G4 summit happening, chaired by the Prime Minister himself, not by the foreign ministers this time. It's a big power statement. The Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of Brazil, Indian Prime Minister in the same room. How do you think Washington will view this summit, ma'am?
I'm sorry, were you asking me? I'm having a
Yes,
little
go
difficulty
ahead.
hearing
How
you.
do you see Washington will look at this?
She can't hear you.
Okay, let me try again.
First of all, what really strikes me about your conversation, are you able to hear me? What really strikes me about the
Yes, go
conversation that I've heard so far is how very different the priorities seem from New York and from Washington. We've just concluded a major strategic and commercial dialogue with India, which concluded by all accounts very successfully.
Yeah.
The communique was a long laundry list of issues, but it had a couple of important ones on it. The expansion of our defense relationship, a number of very constructive issues on trade, which has traditionally been one of the most difficult areas, a big focus on Indian Ocean and Asia-Pacific relations, including the U.S.-Japan-India trilateral, and what's being called now a diplomatic partnership, including dialogues not just on East Asia, which began some time ago, but on the Middle East, the UN and multilateral space, and Africa. Now, I see that as the foundation for a more constructive relationship in the multilateral world, both the UN and the trade world, which for many years has been the most difficult part of the U.S.-India relationship. Ambassador Puri describes the U.S. position as unhelpful. I have not worked in the UN. I can't really comment on that. I can say, though, that there's been kind of two different ways of looking at the UN Security Council issue within the U.S. government. At the grand strategic level, the issue of India being the world's largest democracy is very much a factor, and I think that was the basic reason that President Obama formally supported India's candidacy when he came to Delhi in 2010. If you go down below that level, and not very far below that level, what you run into is the fact that India and the United States have pursued very different agendas in the UN, and that those who work at the UN in the U.S. government are acutely conscious that the first consequence of a permanent Indian seat would be a lot more friction over the day-to-day business of the Security Council. This may not be a big strategic consideration, but it's a tactical consideration that a lot of people find compelling. I personally support having India as a permanent member, but I see no sense of urgency in the U.S. government or in any of the other permanent five. And as Ambassador Puri said, China is giving polite opposition, basically, to the idea. In order to get anywhere in India's candidacy for a permanent seat, or any change in the UN Charter, you have to have 2/3 of the General Assembly, including all 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So that's the arithmetic, and that's what I see as the dynamics with the United States. I should also say, though, that
Let me get a quick
at
word in
no
from
time has moving forward on the Security Council. Let me just finish one sentence, please.
Okay.
At no time has this issue been put at the heart of U.S.-India relations by either the United States or India. We've been working on other things, mostly but not entirely bilateral, and have been moving ahead in a relationship that's driven basically by those interests that converge between the two countries.
So it's interesting, you say it's not at the centerpiece of the equation. Ambassador K.C. Singh, before I come back to my guest in New York, let me bring you in. How do you see this this G4 summit? Is it a game changer, or is that is that a moment that's too far away for it to actually be a game changer?
Barkha, I think we are asking the wrong question. The question is not whether India can become a permanent member, or Japan can, or Brazil can. The question is, how do you get the Charter of the UN amended? Which means you need 2/3 of the membership to amend the Charter and bring more chairs to the horseshoe table. Now there the differences come in. If you go to the UN General Assembly President's letter, that has the annexures which run into 26 pages, which raises questions like categories of membership. How many more permanent, how many non-permanent? Regional representation, role of veto, functioning of the Security Council, etc., etc. The minute you come to an expansion, for instance, the time when I was Additional Secretary, I used to represent India at the G4 meetings. US opinion at that stage was that they don't want too large an expansion. They said at 15, which is 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members, they can barely make Security Council function some of the time or most of the time. They said the minute you make it larger, particularly when you say go beyond 17 or 18, it just becomes unworkable from their point of view. Now, anything less than 25, 26 does not get you 2/3 membership of the UN voting. They are not interested in India or in Brazil. They are interested in, does Africa get 2 seats? Does Latin America get 1? Do the Europeans get another seat? And then the non-permanent seats, and then the spoilers come in. So what the permanent members are doing is they keep your hopes up, but they realize that the spoilers in it are far too many who will come in with long-term non-permanent seats, fewer permanent ones, many more non-permanent ones, renewable non-permanent ones. There are about half a dozen different combinations. What will happen at the summit level if the 4 leaders meet?
So
finally, the Brazilians are no longer carrying. Also see, just one last point. See the geopolitical situation. The relationship between Russia and US, between China and US today is not what it was 5 years ago or 6 years ago. It's a much more confrontational relationship. In that, they are not necessarily going to go along with what the Americans may say or may not say. So the Security Council permanent membership is more divided today. And I think therefore geopolitically there is much less will there to move ahead and reform in this kind of a fraction. And also look at the weightage of the countries. Brazil has been downgraded. It is no longer a country which it was 5 years ago. The Japanese have come back with Abe, but look at their confrontation with China. And the Chinese have a run. So,
yeah. I know it's very complex, but Shinzo Abe is flying in especially for this. Japan is the country that actually was keenest on this meeting. Ambassador Puri, you will know this more than me. There was great emphasis on getting Merkel in the room. She could only do it at this time. So Shinzo Abe gets in at 7 in the morning, flies in for this summit especially. But Casey and Terry Schaffer are bringing very different perspectives. Terry's actually saying this is not at the heart of Indo-US relations.
No, she's entitled to her view, and she's perhaps right that it's not been at the heart of Indo-US relationship. But I have a completely different take on this.
Which is?
My take is that there are 2 processes involved. One is the General Assembly process. If today a resolution is floated and put to vote, a framework resolution which calls for a modest expansion of the Security Council, something like 24 or 25, with expansion in both categories, following the UN Charter and UN criteria. My considered view is that framework resolution will get the required 128 votes. Yes. Once that happens,
this is possible.
Oh, absolutely possible. The second issue, whether the charter amendment will take place, whether Washington will decide this is important or not, I would like to see how they react to public opinion if the resolution goes through the General Assembly. And once it goes through, that is a game changer that will produce a new dynamic. Let's not bring yesterday's appreciation of what happened 20 years ago to today's reality. The very fact that the Security Council is fragmented, the very fact that there is no P5 unity, in fact, gives you an opportunity.
So you're
in fact,
disagreeing with Casey? Casey saying it makes it tougher.
I disagree with him profoundly on this. I mean, I sit here, work on this issue, and you know, also he's a student of literature, I'm a student of history. And the Berlin Wall, did you know 6 months before it was going to fall, it will fall?
Yeah.
Look, we have to work the power of possibility. Therefore, I started by saying that the G4 leaders have to take courage. And I think if you look at the personality of the 4 people who are going to be in the room, ably led by the Prime Minister of India, and with Abe, Merkel and Dilma, I think they can bring about the gravitas required to give a signal that we go ahead. Whether it happens or not, we have to work the power of possibility. I keep coming back to that. But let's not be cynical about it and say it will never happen.
No, I mean, I think we need to take a step back and see what the UNSC is a reflection of global governance. You know, I mean, it is not an end unto itself. And in that sense, actually, the G4 meeting, even if there's no real progress towards UNSC reform this time around, the very fact that the G4 country leaders are coming together, it's the first time it's happened since 2004. At that time, there were 4 very different leaders in charge of those 4 countries. So the very fact that they're even coming together for this summit is significant on its own. I mean, the fact
symbolism?
Symbolism,
in making a statement about shifting power dynamics
the
globally?
fact that you're seeing habits of cooperation develop amongst Germany, which is arguably the powerhouse in Europe, Japan, which is rejuvenating, Shinzo Abe is trying his best to rejuvenate the economy and make he's very diplomatically active, Narendra Modi in India, and then Dilma in Brazil. I think you have 4 in some ways very, very strong leaders.
Raj?
Well, you know, if I could, listening to this back and forth, I feel like I'm at the United Nations as some ambassadors argue with each other over bureaucratic wrangling, and I think, frankly, if you step back for a second and you look at what's really going on, this is a political process. And so I think Terry nails it when she says that it's a question of the sense of urgency. So this notion that...
But she's also making the point that the priorities are completely different.
Well, no, what I heard her saying, which I think I largely agree with, is that this will come, these things take time, and there are other important priorities.
70 years, the charter called for reform and review in 1945. You undertook an expansion in 62, 63. Look, what is evident is the process has been manipulated. People have used every trick in the book to stop it. Now that suddenly that's been exposed, you have a resolution, you have a text. What you can do is come to the floor of the House and say, we don't agree with the text. But you know, all this lure of consensus, you know, consensus cannot mean that if you have 193 minus 13, that is the strength of the Uniting for Consensus, those 13 countries, and 2 or 3 members of the Security Council. If those 15 or 16 countries can stop the 193, look, there is a different dynamic here. There is a different atmospheric here. When the negotiations start in November, we will either have the benefit of a joint G4 position, or the world will turn around and say the G4 gather, periodically, make a lot of noise, but then don't pursue their ambition.
It's also a test of whether this will become a redundant
forum or either that. I have always said if the G4, because as I said, the G4 has not always been united. Very often it has looked like a G3 or a G2. I have always said take it away. There are other groups like the L69, which is a cross-cutting developing country group from different regions with 45 members or so. Somebody can float it. My own sense is that no country which believes in the UN Charter and which believes in democratic decision-making will find it easy to cast a negative vote when their name is there and the whole world is seeing what they are saying. The kind of discussion my friend here and Terry Schaefer from there are saying, this is the traditional American position.
Let me just get a quick word. I have time just for final comments. Terry, 30 seconds, a concluding remark. You heard Ambassador Puri. He's saying we waited too long. We waited 70 years. You can't keep saying, give this
wait
more
another
time.
70. Wait another 70. The UN will become the world's largest NGO by that time.
Okay.
This is what we call filibuster.
Okay, one minute. Casey, you first, then Terry. 30 seconds each. Casey, go ahead.
Yes. No, I thought to my good friend Hardeep Puri, let me remind him, I'm not only a student of literature, but also of law. May I just come in?
Law, yes, that's also true.
Hello.
Yeah.
I said I'm also, Hardeep, a student of law.
Yes, Casey, go ahead.
And so let me remind him that what the Americans What the Americans
I
used
know
to tell
that. I have
us,
always
and that
sought
is
legal
constant,
advice
it doesn't
from
matter if it was 5 years ago. Just a minute. Just a minute. Because they have to run any amendment past their Senate. Can a US government get it past the Senate? You know, they're 10 minutes. In fact, you will create convergence amongst the P5 by ramming a new resolution down their throat. They will come to, the Chinese and the Americans will come together. So I disagree counter vehemently on what Hardeep is saying.
You can spend another few years then.
Okay, I'm
Of
out
course.
of time. I'm out of time.
It doesn't
I'll give you
harm
quick
us.
all of you
You
quick
know-
last concluding remarks. Ambassador Puri,
Look,
last word.
I am not suggesting that after a GA resolution we should do the next steps on ratification. That can take years.
Yeah.
But let's get a GA resolution. After that, the public opinion will build. Either we will take this process to its logical
What
conclusion.
are you looking for on Saturday morning?
I'm
when-
looking for a decision from the G4 which restates the G4 position and gives a clear signal that the G4 countries will pursue their ambition and their stated desire for permanent membership, and then the process can begin. The process need not conclude in the during the course of the 70th year.
but it has to shift.
But it has to start. And once it starts, once you take the issue to the through a framework resolution to the GA, after that it can take 5 years for the United States to persuade its Senate. It can take time for the Russian, but at least we would have done what this process is all about.
We leave it there. Ambassador Puri, Dhruv Jaishankar, Raj Goyal, Terry Schaffer and KC Singh, thank you for joining us on the buck stops here. The Prime Minister has met with Sheikh Hasina. He's also met with a number of American CEOs this morning in New York, and they flagged key issues in the areas of concern: the tax regime, deregulation, infrastructure. On the other side of the debate, Modi says he means business, but does he really? Where's the red carpet for reform, and is the pace of economic reform far too slow? You have economists like Jagdish Bhagwati telling the buck stops here that the Commerce Ministry is led by a left-leaning minister. Is he being fair, or is India protectionist by instinct? All that and more coming up on the other side.
Thank you.
Moving on now to our other big focus on the Buck Stops Here special that is broadcasting to you from New York through this week. And today, of course, we're at the Vermilion Restaurant. We are now looking at what is the centerpiece of the Prime Minister's visit. Does Modi mean business? Literally? That's certainly the message he's carrying. He's quite accepted that the route from Delhi to Washington must first pass through Wall Street. But with an increasing debate over the pace of economic reforms back home in India, can he really hard sell the message? Where is the red carpet for reforms? Joining us now here at the Vermilion in New York. We're out on the streets. It's a very New York morning. Let me introduce our very special panel, Kiran Shaw. We, of course, know her as one of India's best-known industrialists and a woman who doesn't pull her punches. Also, my pleasure to introduce Deepak Narula. He is, of course, the head of Meta Capital Management, one of the best hedge fund managers. Rohini Day, the owner of Vermilion, but also a background with McKinsey. And economics, makes the very fascinating transition to being a foodie. And of course, joining me from Delhi, well-known economist and writer Surjit Bhalla is with us, and Siddharth Billa, well-known industrialist, is with us as well. Deepak, let me start with you. What's the expectation? You know, last year there was a novelty factor to the Prime Minister being here. 1 year later, people are going to be looking for hard promises, concrete development. It may not work on glitz and glamour anymore. It may not work only on the dinner at the Waldorf for 47 American CEOs being cooked up by Vikas Khanna. What's the hardball facts and figures that American business is looking for?
Well, I think a lot of optimism, as you point out, over the last year with, with Prime Minister Modi's election and all that he's promised. And some of the things that he has done are more symbolic, and certainly focus on rooting out corruption in India is viewed very positively from the outside. That's always been viewed as something that makes India a very hard country to do business in. But in the end, the changes that he needs to put in place are much more fundamental and long-term in nature, and those take time. And so certainly there is now the question of, he talks the talk really well, but how does he walk the walk?
Yeah. And what's the opinion on that?
Opinion, that question, I think, to give him more time. I think it's a country of, $1.25 billion people. Things don't change overnight. It's a system that's entrenched in a certain way of working, and he's trying to shake things up. And you really have to give him more time. And certainly, that doesn't mean that you you evaluate him only at the end of 5 years.
Yeah.
And so then you shut your eyes and say, it's going to take too long, so you just have to be patient. The steps that it takes along the way obviously are very important. And there's some very obvious things in India that pose big problems for business.
So give an example of what poses a big problem before I take it to Kiran.
Well, I think one of the most fundamental problems in India is infrastructure. If you have a country that can't provide you water, electricity, roads, how are you going to set up businesses? How are you going to want to live there? If you think about people wanting to relocate businesses to India.
Yeah.
Personally for myself, if I had to kind of think of that route, that would be a very, very big deal. Like, is the place livable? Right? And so those are very fundamental things. And so clearly there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, but rightly so, and infrastructure can't be built overnight. But the question is, what are the moves that are being made to actually show that there's actual progress being made on that front?
So let me take that to Kiran. Kiran, you have warned about an impatience that may set in. And you're hearing Deepak say, give the PM more time. Do you think that impatience is beginning to set in? Do you think people are actually beginning to now ask, is the Prime Minister even really a market reformer? Is he a market reformer?
I think he is. I think there's no doubt about it that this focus on ease of doing business is going to change things. The fact that he came out with a ranking for the state governments also to be very, very focused on this ease of doing business challenge that India has is a step in the right direction. And as Deepak said, I think, we have actually had decades of a very command and control economy, a very over-regulated economy, and I think this is a legacy that the Prime Minister has to now dismantle in a very, very challenging way.
But you and others, Rahul Bajaj, everybody's been expressing a lot of concern about the tax regime. And even when you come here, you hear all these questions about retrospective tax. MAT has gone, but a lot of people are saying, is that enough? When you look at the pace of reforms, does it worry you? Or are you, like Deepak, saying, okay, hang on, we can afford to be a little more patient?
There are certain aspects of the reform process which need to be speeded up.
Yeah. For example?
For example, this whole aspect about, the taxation regime. There needs to be a very strong, clear message that this is what the tax regime is going to be all about. I think there are certain regulatory, implementations that need to be done expeditiously. But other than that, I think if you look at a lot of the steps the government is taking in removing a large number of unnecessary rules and regulations, I think it's a step in the right direction. And as Deepak says, we are taking one step at a time, but we need to take those steps faster. Now,
what in particular concerns you, especially about the tax regime?
I think I would,
and the infrastructure.
Well, I think what Deepak has touched upon is extremely important. What really worries us is how are we going to address infrastructure development, and not just that, how are we going to finance infrastructure development? Because I think it's really sort of we are underestimating the challenge of funding and financing infrastructure. If we want private sector to come in and be a 50% partner to build this very important infrastructure, it's not going to be easy. We need to really focus on those policies. Yesterday I was at a very interesting panel discussion on China and US relations, and it's very interesting to see that China's real focus now on infrastructure development is about sanitation, sewerage and water. Exactly the kind of infrastructure challenges that we need to leapfrog and make sure that we do it right from the start.
I'm going to come back to your concerns, but a quick comment there. You said infrastructure. Where are the roads? Where are the basics, the basic building blocks to do business? What apart from infrastructure concerns you? There was an anticipation that that Modi-nomics, as it's called, would be very different from Manmohan-nomics. I'm just wondering if both of you actually think that. Is it fundamentally different, Deepak, what you've seen so far?
I think it is. I think it's really the message comes from the top, and I think it's the team you put in place around you. It's not a one-man show.
Yeah.
And so having good people around you and having, the whole Make in India campaign. It sounds like a little gimmicky and a little bit of a slogan, but really at the end of the day, he's trying to get people thinking in the right way. That think positively, think about all the good things that you can do.
Beyond the slogans, is it different?
Yeah.
Beyond the slogans, is it different?
I think one of the things. Jump in here. I do
really
think in the last 1 year, to give him credit, FDI has grown by 20 to 30%, depending on what census numbers you take. In 1 year, that's a tremendous leap. It's catapulted us from the 15th to the 9th largest FDI base. But we're still at 30 billion. We are a quarter of what China draws. And we need to get to at least 60, given that we have an enormous manufacturing and services sector to catapult.
Yeah.
We have a demographic dividend that's going to be a ticking time bomb if we don't have the jobs. So his push on Make in India and also cultivating the CEOs and cultivating allies economically, externally, diplomacy is I think, absolutely the right vision, no question. But your point about impatience, I mean, to quote GE Jeff Immelt,
Yeah.
right vision, but we need execution, more execution, faster execution, any execution.
I'm going to look at the irritants between the two countries in a moment, but two quick comments from Delhi. Surjit, there's been a lot of discussion over whether Modi, people who thought the Prime Minister was going to be the next Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, had in fact got him wrong. Jagdish Bhagwati in an interview to me said trade continues to be protectionist. He of course believes it's because Nirmala Sitharaman studied at JNU. But what's the view from Delhi? I mean, you've seen a restlessness setting in the corporate community. How do you judge the Prime Minister's hard sell for India when the red carpet for reforms has not quite been rolled out back at home?
One thing that all of us who expected him to be a real reformer, we all forgot that there's something called the Rajya Sabha, and that in the Rajya Sabha there's something called the Congress Party, which is hell-bent on making sure that none of the legislations pass. So I wouldn't blame Modi necessarily for the fact that the GST hasn't passed, which was a big measure, and if you will, the land acquisition bill hasn't passed. What I would blame Modi and his team was on the flip-flops and the rather ham-handed way they handled the entire retrospective tax issue, which thankfully has gone away. Now, let's separate out, at least as far as the Indian perspective is concerned, and I will try and bring in all the three. There are three aspects to the administration. The first is the macroeconomy. And the macroeconomy in India, where macroeconomy is called growth and inflation, is the best I've ever seen, the best India has ever had. And a lot of effort has gone in by Modi and his team, Modinomics if you will, to make that succeed. And I think broadly they have succeeded very well. The second aspect is the reforms, which I just touched on, and it's not clear how much of that blame should be at Modi's door. The third aspect, which is where the Modi team gets very, very negative marks, is on the, if you will, non-economic aspects, which does affect perception, which does affect expectations. And we've got a Tea Party that makes the Republican Tea Party look like, if you will, child's play. And this Tea Party from the BJP side is making lots of very stupid noises, and if you will, is a lot of pinpricks into the Modi regime, and if you will, affecting perceptions of all of us. That listen, do these guys have their act together if they can't shut up their own people? So I think, so I think if you look at these three, if you separate them, if you separate the three aspects, I think you get a rather rounded and I think an unbiased view of what has happened in India over the last year.
I'm going to take that to the panel in a moment, but Siddharth, if you just want to weigh in, how would you describe the mood of the business community in India? Right now we're talking about American CEOs, but as an industrialist, would you say it's impatient, it's restless, it's happy? What's the adjective you'd use, Siddharth?
The adjective I'd use is that we are enthused, but for much of the Indian business community, it's a case of the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. Because we have inherent weaknesses, our consumer demand hasn't picked up the way we expected, and I don't think the government has a huge role to play in that. It is just the way that the economics of the consumer market are playing out. That means you are left with debt on your balance sheets, you are left with surplus capacity. So really speaking, India Inc. is also not in a position, if you like, to add to capacity, and they have a waiting period. When we spoke of impatience, for example, we were trying to measure the impatience. I think we needed to get our anchors right. For example, when I was in FICCI, we had always from day one said that whichever government comes, and the government was not announced then, it will take a minimum of 18 to 24 months from the time they come in for results to start showing. And you know, we are still 15 months down the line, and really speaking, a lot of action has been taken. And if I can very quickly add, why, you know, the American CEOs and everybody, now tomorrow we are on the first anniversary of Make in India, 25th September. You know, every foreign CEO does a lot of their homework. They don't just line up to come and shake hands with the Prime Minister. Now, what is it? You know, the government spending is trying to push the economy. The other one is when the foreign manufacturers set up base in India to service the Indian market, because the economics are definitely in favor of make here versus import here. So the economics are in favor of that. The economics are not yet favoring domestic manufacturing to pick up, which is the third element which hopefully will kick in next year.
Okay, let me just bring this back here now. Kiran, Surjit's point that some of the surround sound of what he calls the Indian Tea Party. You know, you have the sort of loony fringe. You sometimes have ministers in the government talking about cultural cleansing.
Mahesh Sharma,
as Rohini, I can see you've been following the news here. Surjit is linking it to the business environment, that it does impact the international image of India. Do you agree?
Well, I think, you know, when I talk to the CEOs here in the US, I don't think that is really playing out. I mean,
what are you hearing from them?
I think they are very positive on what bodes good for India, but they have been saying that it is still very frustrating for them to start their businesses, operate their businesses, and they want clarity in terms of policies. And I think there is a lag phase. I think one of the panelists talked about, saying that, look, the Modi government is looking at how to dismantle a legacy issue, and it is going to take time before we really see that being sort of fixed.
But you know, Kiran,
in the meantime, I think what is happening is that we are being distracted by what you just described.
The surround sound.
The surround sound is not required. And I think that's where I think Modi has to rein in these fringe elements.
Now, we don't need our headlines to be about beef ban and mutton ban and cultural cleansing and all the rest of that.
I don't think that's going to impact investment in India per se. But I think it's a nuisance value and we must avoid it. You know?
So I disagree a little bit here, Kiran. I'm going to take a little bit of a different stance. I actually think it does a huge disservice to our image. Not for investment per se, but also for tourism, for culture. I mean, we don't have to wallow in parochialism and insularity to be proud of our heritage. And his on the grounds of statements he's talking about cultural pollution, I actually think he should be replaced fundamentally. That's my perspective.
And you're saying that there's a messaging of India abroad and it hits that. Deepak, what is of the biggest concern? You know, I want to bring up something. I think Kiran will also want to come in on it. We've been following this fascinating story of a pharma company here that decides to overnight just hike up the price of an AIDS, you know, a medicine for HIV.
An
anti-infection HIV, because he thinks he can make more money. Now, Indians look at this and say, you know, this is why we want protection for generic drugs. This is why we disagree on patents. You know, Kiran, I mean, I don't know if this is more your turf, but this is kind of brazen capitalism of the kind which just looks like greed.
Well, I can tell you that...
And therefore Indians would say we are right to actually be disagreeing with the Americans on patent law.
No, but let me tell you that this has not gone down well even in the US. In fact, you know, Turing Pharma...
it's going to be cutting the price.
Is actually... you know, been caught off guard, and I think they realize that they have done something extremely damaging. And I think the biotech sector is livid about this kind of, you know, brazenness in trying to take advantage of a situation.
Things like this will happen. I mean, these are one-off things. You can't judge a system, you can't judge a society, you can't judge a people by you know, these very fringe kind of moves that happen. And just one point that I'd like to make about India. It is in a time where there is a lot of turmoil globally. You can see China is in distress, you can see Europe is in distress, you can see US equity markets have fallen also. One of the, you know, bright spots has been India. Even the stock market has fallen, the rupee has fallen, and that's not surprising, but it's done a lot better than a lot of other places. And one of the reasons is the Indian economy is really driven by domestic demand more than, so Make in India is great, but Make in India to sell to Indians is really what's driving things. And if you see some of the things
And
that,
who's going to spend the money? The problem in India right now is nobody's spending. The government isn't spending because they want to cut down on their deficit. So where's the cash flow into the market?
it's going to be the consumer in the end, and
Yeah.
see some of the changes that are happening. I was talking about infrastructure earlier
Yeah.
and pointing out things that don't work. There are some things in India that actually are really good. If you see, India today has close to 1 billion cell phone users. That's spectacular.
Yeah.
If you think about
Yes,
internet
but,
penetration in India, I
yes,
guess
but-
we have a disagreement. If you think about bank accounts, there are close to 200 million new bank accounts that were opened.
And what's the disagreement?
So Deepak, I think it's closer to 300 million cell phone users, but maybe it's
What's the
maybe,
disagreement?
whatever.
Or maybe it's
But
headed to a
but
billion.
But
Maybe
it's
it's not.
very patchy connections.
Yeah.
It's no broadband or even a fraction. So what we deem as connectivity on the fringe is really not as
So
deep
let me take
at
this
all.
back to Delhi
Yeah.
and we'll get final comments. Surjit, you said we all forgot there's a thing called the Rajya Sabha, and that explains why goods and services tax, land acquisition ran into rough weather. But there's also one theory that Mr. Modi may not quite be the free market reformer that people thought he would be. He also has the RSS, whose economics are closer to the left than they are to Manmohan Singh even. Surjit.
Yeah, no. We know that the economics of the RSS is identical to the economics of the left and is identical to the economics of the Sonia Gandhi Congress. That we knew all along. But I do think that the perception that I had of Modi being a market reformer remains. I think he's very much a market reformer. As some of the panelists have pointed out, the entire Make in India business cannot really operate unless we reform. I'll tell you one other thing why he's a genuine market reformer. For the first time in India's 67 or 68-year history, we have that, being an entrepreneur and making a profit is not something evil. That has been the perception in India of every government, especially the Congress government, over most of our post-independence period. That is beginning to change.
But he is on the
It's a
defensive
mindset
about the
that
Soot
is
Boot Ki
changing.
Sarkar Jai. Surjit, I would disagree with you there. I would disagree. I think he's got defensive about being known as a government that's soft on the rich. I mean, Kiran, wouldn't you say, that there is a kind of defensiveness about the whole Soot Boot Ki Sarkar sloganeering around it?
Not really, because he's had to sort of, punch back at what Rahul Gandhi said.
Yeah.
But I don't think he's apologizing for wealth creation. In fact, he's supporting the startup entrepreneurship
But what about the
culture.
tax laws? You've got everybody from Rahul Bajaj to yourself saying these tax laws, the black money laws, that they're spooking industry.
Well, I think, they need to be a little more thoughtful about the way they're going about it, because I think everyone knows that black money is not just attributable to the business community. I think there's a lot of black money in the political circles.
Oh, the biggest.
So I think that's what the whole sort of mockery is all about.
So I'm going to get last comments from all of you. 30 seconds to everybody. Siddharth, what's the biggest concern in the chambers of commerce and business back home in India? One biggest concern, one thing that's begun to worry you.
I don't think there's much to worry us. I mean, other than the usual interest rates and, sorting out the balance sheets. But I think the time has come, and as Surjit rightly said, that, the political process is going to take its own time. And therefore, I think a sort of redoubled pressure on executive actions and implementation at the operating level, because I think the top 2 or 3 echelons of every ministry, every government are working very hard. But when we actually spend the money on the ground, it's the implementation mechanism and carrying the states with you that is required. So I think we are looking for far more executive action than we would have seen in the last 3 months.
Okay, Surjit, very quickly, Jagdish Bhagwati's remarks that the commerce minister is left-leaning because she studied at JNU, and that explains India's closed attitude on trade. I mean, I argued with him. I said, why pick on one person? She's obviously representing the government's point of view. But do you believe that we continue to be protectionist by instinct?
No, this is part of the mindset change that is happening. So I disagree with Professor Bhagwati. I think that's not to say that we are now completely open-minded and open markets, but we're very much getting there. So we will have stumbling blocks. Listen, when you try to change minds, when you try to change attitudes, it'll take time, and it's been there only 1 year. So I think there is no question in my mind that the direction is very much what most of us who believe in economic reforms is providing. He's emphasizing economic freedom, he's emphasizing markets, he's emphasizing, if you will, individual merit, etc. We just saw that in Gujarat. I think the trend is very, very positive on the economic side. I have no problems whatsoever with where the Indian economy is headed. It certainly can go there faster, infrastructure can happen faster, interest rates should fall faster, etc. But the direction, absolutely clear.
But we're already hearing, Kiran, that there was a JP Morgan roundtable of CEOs that the Prime Minister has attended this morning. There's going to be later today a dinner with 47 American CEOs. The concerns that are being flagged are deregulation not happening fast enough and tax laws.
And dispute resolution.
And this has been raised at the highest level at that round table. Deregulation not fast enough and the tax regime. How do you weigh in on these concerns by American CEOs? I want to ask all of you as last comments. Kiran.
Well, I think, the government is very seized of these particular issues.
Then why is it not happening? Why is it not happening?
Well, I think it has to now start getting, implemented sooner than later.
Do you agree with these concerns that are being expressed by American CEOs?
I think there is a certain genuine concern about, you just heard, we've all had this discussion saying that there has to be far more clarity on our tax regime.
Yeah.
And, this whole aspect of dispute resolution was flagged.
Do you think the tax regime is too punitive? Is still too punitive in approach?
I don't think it's about being punitive. I think it's about, the ambiguousness of this tax regime.
Deepak, the concerns being, flagged by American business.
I think they're real and legitimate, and that's great feedback for the local governments there, the governments there to make changes.
What's the biggest concern you're picking up from here?
I guess I still drink the Modi Kool-Aid, so I'm a buyer, right?
Still drink the Modi Kool-Aid, okay.
So I think the concern is the pace. I think most people feel the direction is the right direction, and that's a huge change. I mean, until recently, the direction wasn't the right direction.
So direction is good, speed isn't so
speed,
good.
obviously, and that's to be expected.
Rohini, quickly, and then I'll give Kiran the last word.
He is losing the sheen. And
losing the sheen
and has a limited period. We'd hope for much more. Manmohan did wonders in 91. We hope for double of that for Modi. It's been 18 months.
But you had corruption as a headline then, and the one big
and
change
we must
emphasize is that corruption is not a story coming out of India. There are other unwanted headlines,
true,
but not
but
corruption.
certain scandals are arising. That being said, he's done plenty to clean up, and I hope that will pay off.
Biggest concern between deregulation not happening, tax regime, dispute resolution, what would you flag? What are you picking up from your American friends?
I think, it's really about what Deepak is saying. The direction is right, but the speed has to improve.
We leave it there. Kiran Shaw, Deepak Narula, Rohini Dey, Sujit Bhalla, Siddharth Birla, thank you so much. Pleasure to have all of you on this special episode of The Buck Stops Here. We'll be taking a break and there's more coming up on the other side.